The leather of the Aston Martin's passenger seat was smoother than anything Elias had ever touched. It was a cool, creamy beige that seemed to glow in the ambient light of the city at dusk. For the past 3 years, his world had been the worn fabric of his Toyota Camry, the faint scent of 1,000 different air fresheners, and the endless cycle of pickups and drop-offs that was the life of an Uber driver. His passenger, a man named Julian Croft, was staring out the window, his sharp suit a stark contrast to Elias's own faded polo shirt. Croft was a man who moved with an easy confidence, a man whose name was whispered in the high-stakes world of finance and technology. He was also, as of 5 minutes ago, the most peculiar passenger Elias had ever had. It had started as a routine trip. A ping from a high-end hotel, a man in a suit, a destination across town. But Croft had been different. He hadn't buried his face in his phone or taken a call. He had watched Elias drive. Really watched him. He'd commented on his smooth lane changes, his precise braking, the way he anticipated the chaotic flow of city traffic. "You drive like you've done it for a living," Croft had said, his voice a low rumble. Elias had offered a tight smile. "I do, sir. I'm an Uber driver." Croft had shaken his head. "No, I mean, professionally. Like on a track." Elias's hands had tightened on the wheel. "A long time ago," he'd murmured, his voice barely audible. And then had come the invitation. An invitation so outlandish, so utterly bizarre, that Elias was sure it was a joke. Croft was hosting a private track day at a nearby racing circuit. A collection of supercars, a handful of wealthy enthusiasts, and a few professional drivers to offer instruction. He wanted Elias to come. Not as a driver, but as a guest. "I have a feeling you'd appreciate it," Croft had said, his eyes twinkling with a strange intensity. And so, here Elias was, being chauffeured in a car that cost more than his entire life's earnings, on his way to a world he had left behind a decade ago. A world of screaming engines, burning rubber, and the intoxicating dance on the edge of control. A world that had almost destroyed him. The track was a ribbon of black asphalt laid out against a backdrop of rolling green hills. The air was thick with the smell of high-octane fuel and the sound of roaring engines. A row of exotic cars stood gleaming under the setting sun, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Porsches. It was a billionaire's playground, and Elias felt a familiar ache in his chest, a phantom limb of a life he had once lived. Croft introduced him to the other guests, a collection of hedge fund managers, tech moguls, and their immaculately dressed partners. They were polite, but their eyes slid over Elias's simple clothes, his calloused hands, his quiet demeanor. He was an anomaly, a curiosity. The Uber driver the eccentric millionaire had brought to a racing event. He watched as they took to the track, their expensive toys a blur of color and noise. They were clumsy, their movements jerky and uncertain. They had the money, but they lacked the soul. The deep, intuitive connection between man and machine that only comes from a lifetime of dedication. Croft eventually cornered him by the pit wall. "You haven't gone out yet," he said, a knowing smile on his face. Elias shook his head. "Not my world anymore." "Once a driver, always a driver," Croft countered. He gestured to a sleek, silver McLaren parked at the end of the pit lane. "That one's mine. Take it for a spin." Elias hesitated. The urge was a physical thing, a hunger he had suppressed for so long. He could almost feel the grip of the steering wheel, the pressure of the pedals, the surge of acceleration. But the fear was there too. The memory of the crash, the searing pain, the long, dark road to recovery. "I don't have a helmet," he said, his voice weak. Croft snapped his fingers, and an assistant appeared with a brand new helmet, its glossy black surface reflecting the twilight sky. "No more excuses," Croft said, his voice gentle but firm. The moment Elias slid into the driver's seat, it was like coming home. The cockpit enveloped him, the controls falling naturally to hand. He took a deep breath, the scent of leather and metal a potent cocktail of memory and desire. He started the engine, and the car roared to life, a symphony of mechanical perfection. He pulled out onto the track, his movements slow and deliberate. He took a few laps to get a feel for the car, to reacquaint himself with the delicate balance of power and control. With each lap, his confidence grew. The muscle memory, buried for so long, began to resurface. He started to push, to explore the limits of the car, of himself. He was no longer Elias, the Uber driver. He was Elias Vance, the boy who had grown up in the shadow of a racetrack, the prodigy who had dominated the European karting circuit, the young man who had been on the cusp of a Formula One career. He began to pass the other cars, his movements fluid and precise. He danced through the corners, his lines perfect, his braking points exact. He was a ghost, a phantom of a driver they had never known existed. The other guests pulled into the pits, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. They gathered by the pit wall, their conversations silenced, their attention fixed on the silver McLaren that was carving up the track with a skill that bordered on supernatural. "Who is that?" one of them asked, his voice hushed. Croft smiled. That, he said, is Elias Vance. The name meant nothing to them. But to a handful of people in the world of motorsport, it was a name that had once been synonymous with greatness. A name that had been whispered in the same breath as the legends of the sport. Elias finished his run and pulled into the pits, his heart pounding, his body coursing with adrenaline. He took off his helmet, his face flushed, his eyes shining with a light that had been extinguished for a decade. The other guests surrounded him, their questions a torrent of excitement and confusion. Where did you learn to drive like that? Have you raced professionally? Who are you? Elias was overwhelmed, the sudden attention a stark contrast to the anonymity of his life as an Uber driver. He looked to Croft, who stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. Ladies and gentlemen, Croft said, his voice ringing with pride, allow me to introduce you to Elias Vance, the 2015 Formula 2 champion. A stunned silence fell over the group. They stared at Elias, their minds struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet Uber driver with the reality of a former champion. The story, when it finally came out, was a tragic one. A story of a young driver on the verge of a Formula 1 contract, a horrific crash during a test session, a career cut short by a devastating leg injury. A story of a man who had lost everything and had been forced to rebuild his life from the ashes. The news of Elias's re-emergence spread like wildfire through the motorsport community. The video of his laps in the McLaren went viral, a testament to a talent that had been dormant but not extinguished. A few days later, Elias received a call. It was from a man named Marcus Thorne, the team principal of a new Formula E team. He had seen the video. He had heard the stories. He wanted to offer Elias a test drive. Elias was hesitant. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of his stomach. But the fire had been rekindled. The passion, the desire, the love for the sport that had been his life. He accepted the offer. The test was a success. Elias was faster than he had ever been, his driving style a perfect fit for the all-electric racing series. Thorne offered him a contract on the spot. A few months later, Elias was back on the grid, a professional racing driver once again. He was older, wiser, his body scarred but his spirit unbroken. He was no longer the boy wonder, the prodigy. He was a man who had faced adversity and had emerged stronger. He went on to win the Formula E championship in his rookie season, a feat that had never been accomplished before. He became a symbol of hope, an inspiration to anyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough, that their dreams were out of reach. And it all started with a simple Uber ride. A chance encounter with a millionaire who had seen something in him that he had thought was long gone. A man who had given him a second chance. As he stood on the podium, the championship trophy in his hands, Elias looked out at the cheering crowd. He saw Croft standing by the pit wall, a proud smile on his face. He raised the trophy in a silent salute, a gesture of gratitude to the man who had changed his life. He was Elias Vance, the Uber driver who had become a champion. And his story was just beginning. Subscribe and like for more stories that will inspire and move you.